Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instructions English Grammar Series. The topic of this program is using verbs correctly. Now, as you may remember, the verb is the most important word in any sentence. It's the heart of the action, kind of like the engine in a car. A lot of the work done by the sentence is driven by the verb. So understanding verbs and using them correctly is very important. In this program, we'll talk about three common trouble areas in using English verbs: verb tenses, irregular verbs, and the subjunctive mood. If you're ready, let's get started. Verb tenses define the time when an action occurs. They're constructed mainly from two components. First, the principal parts of the verb, and, in some cases, helping verbs. Now, there are four principal parts of any verb in English. These four principal parts are the infinitive, the present participle, the past, and the past participle. Let's take a moment to look at each of these a bit more closely. First, the infinitive. The infinitive is the basic form of the verb. Take a verb like to cook. The infinitive is cook, and the basic form of the verb is the same, cook. The present participle ends in the letters ing. As you'll see, the present participle of any verb is always used with a helping verb, which is a form of the verb to be. Take the verb to cook again. The present participle would be cooking, and it would always be used with a helping verb that's a form of the verb to be. For example, you might say, I was cooking breakfast when the telephone rang. Notice that the present participle cooking is used with the helping verb was, which is a form of the verb to be. Notice, by the way, that the present participle, which ends in ing, looks the same as the gerund. The gerund form of the word cook is cooking. The difference between the gerund and the present participle is the way they're used. As we've seen, the present participle is used as a verb with a helping verb, which is a form of the verb to be. By contrast, a gerund, which looks the same, is used in place of a noun. Therefore, when you see an ing word being used as a noun in a sentence, that's really a gerund, not a present participle. So, for example, I might say, cooking is my favorite hobby. Here we have the word cooking, which looks the same as the present participle, both end in ing, but in this sentence, cooking is a gerund, because it's being used in the same way that a noun would be used. Cooking is my favorite hobby. In that sentence, cooking is the subject of the sentence. It's the subject of the verb is. And remember, the subject of a verb would always be a noun or a pronoun. Since cooking is being used as a noun in that sentence, it's a gerund, not a present participle. The third principal part of any verb is the past. With most verbs, the past ends in ed, and that's the case with the verb to cook. The past form of the verb to cook is cooked. You might say, I cooked breakfast for my sister yesterday morning. And there we're using the past form of the verb ending in ed. And the fourth and final principal part is the past participle. Now, with most verbs, the past participle looks just the same as the past. It also ends in ed. What's the difference? Well, the difference, again, is the way it's used. The past participle is always used with a helping verb, which is a form of the verb to have. So, for example, the past participle of to cook is cooked, but it would be used with a helping verb, such as have cooked. I have cooked breakfast for my family many times. That's an example of how the past participle would be used, with a helping verb, which is a form of the verb to have. These, then, are the four principal parts of any verb: the infinitive, the present participle, the past, and the past participle. And these four principal parts are combined in various ways to create verb tenses. Now, there are many verb tenses in English, but the six most important are the ones we're going to present to you now. Let's begin with the present tense. The present tense is used to describe action that's happening now. It's formed using the basic form of the verb. Now, take the verb to cook. Remember, we saw that the basic or infinitive form of the verb is cook. You would use this in creating the present tense of the verb. For example, I cook. I cook breakfast every morning. Describe something that's happening now. Notice that with certain subjects, you add an S to the end of the basic form. So you would say, he cooks. He cooks breakfast for his wife every morning. Both of these would be forms of the present tense. The second tense to know is the past tense. The past tense describes action happening in the past. Anytime you're talking about something that happened before now, you would use the past tense. And the past tense is formed from the past form of the verb. Remember that with most verbs, the past form is created by adding ed to the basic form of the verb. And that's the way it is with the verb to cook. He cooked dinner last night. We're describing now something that happened in the past, not now, but at a time sometime before now, namely last night. So we would use the past form of the verb ending in ed. The third tense is the future tense. The future tense describes action happening in the future. Now, the future tense is created by using the basic form of the verb and preceding it with the helping verb will. Therefore, if we were describing something that's going to happen tomorrow, let's say, we would create the proper verb by using the helping verb will and adding that to the basic form of the verb, the infinitive. So the future tense of cook would be will cook, and we might say, he will cook dinner for us tomorrow. We're using the future tense because we're describing something that will happen in the future, namely tomorrow. And we use the basic form of the verb, cook, and precede it with a helping verb, will. Now, the fourth tense is called the present perfect tense. And here's where the tenses begin to get a little more complicated. The present perfect tense is used to describe action happening in the past up to the present. If this sounds a little confusing, with a little experience and some practice in reading and using this verb, you'll begin to understand how it's used. Now, the present perfect tense is formed by taking the past participle and putting in front of it the present tense of the verb to have. How does this work? Well, let's take the verb to cook again. What's the past participle of the verb to cook? Well, remember, the past participle is usually formed by adding ed, so the past participle is cooked. Now, the present tense of the verb to have would be, for example, he has. He has is the present tense of the verb to have. When we put that in front of the past participle, we have the present perfect tense. So the present perfect tense of the verb to cook would be, he has cooked. Now, remember, we said that the present perfect is used for actions in the past up to the present. So how might you use he has cooked in a sentence? Well, how about this? He has cooked breakfast for his family every day for the last year. Think about what this sentence is saying. It's talking about someone who has cooked breakfast for his family every day for the past year up to and including today. It's describing action happening in the past right up to the present, not action that was completed and finished sometime in the past, but rather action that's continuing right up to now. When we say he has cooked breakfast every day, we're saying that he continues to do so right up until today. And that's a perfect example of how the present perfect tense would be used. The fifth important tense is the past perfect tense. This is used to describe action happening in the past before some other past action, which would usually be described in the past tense. Remember that the past tense is used for action happening in the past. When you're describing action happening even earlier than a past tense action, you would use the past perfect tense. And we'll see an example in a moment. Now, the past perfect tense is formed by taking the past participle and putting in front of it a verb which is the past tense of the verb to have. Let's use the verb cook again. Remember that the past participle is cooked. Now, if we want to take the past tense of the verb to have, we might say something like, he had. That's the past tense of the verb to have. And when we tack on the past participle afterwards, we have, he had cooked. Now remember, the past perfect tense is used for past actions occurring prior to other past actions. So, for example, we could use the words, he had cooked, in a sentence like this one. He had cooked dinner when suddenly the doorbell rang. Now notice what's happening in this sentence. We're told about two events that happened in the past, the ringing of the doorbell and the cooking of the dinner. Now, which came first? Well, we're told in this sentence that the cooking of the dinner came before the ringing of the doorbell. So the ringing of the doorbell is described in the past tense, while the past perfect tense is used for the cooking of the dinner. Remember, the past perfect tense describes action happening in the past before some past tense action. So the sentence correctly says, he had cooked dinner when suddenly the doorbell rang. The correct sequence of events is clearly explained by the two different tenses that are used in that sentence. Now, the sixth and final basic tense in English is the future perfect tense. This is used to describe action happening in the future before some other action, which is usually described using the future tense. The future perfect tense is created by using the past participle preceded by the future tense form of the verb to have. Now, the future tense of the verb to have is formed with the words will have. So when we take the words will have and follow them by the past participle, we end up with the future perfect tense. Now, once again, for the verb to cook, the past participle is cooked. So the future perfect tense would be formed by using will have followed by cooked. For example, he will have cooked. How would we use this in a sentence? Well, remember, the future perfect tense is used to describe some future event happening before some other future event. Let's look at this example. He will cook dinner tomorrow night, and then he will have cooked dinner every night for a week. Notice what's happening in this sentence. Tomorrow, we're told, he will cook dinner, and when he does that, he will have cooked dinner every night for a week. The action of cooking tomorrow's dinner is taking place in the future tense. He will have cooked dinner every night for a week describes action taken prior to the cooking of tomorrow's dinner. So there's an example of how the future perfect tense is used. Of the 6 basic tenses in English, the future perfect tense is the one that's used least often. Now, how can you be sure that you're using these 6 different forms of English verbs correctly? Here's a tip on using verb tenses properly. The most important thing is to make sure that the tenses you choose match the time of the action and show how different actions are related to one another in time. This means that when 2 actions occur at the same time, they should normally be described using the same verb tense. When 2 actions occur at different times, the verb tenses should show which occurred first and which occurred later. Let's look at a couple of sample sentences that illustrate how this works. Before I cooked dinner, I had walked to the supermarket. In this sentence, 2 actions are described, cooking dinner and walking to the supermarket. What's the sequence of events? Which happened first, which happened later? Well, the first thing that I did was walking to the supermarket. The second thing was cooking dinner. Both are past events, so the proper way to show the time sequence here is to put one event in the past and the event that happened before that in the past perfect tense. And that's done correctly in this sentence. I cooked dinner is in the past tense. I had walked to the supermarket is in the past perfect tense. And that shows that that event happened before the cooking of the dinner. Here's another example. After Miguel sings a song, Annalisa will dance for us. Once again, there are 2 events described in this sentence, Miguel singing and Annalisa dancing. Which is going to happen first and which one will happen second? Well, Miguel singing will happen first, Annalisa, her dance, will happen second. And once again, the tenses are being used correctly here. Miguel sings a song is in the present tense, which tells us that Miguel is singing right now, or perhaps is just about to begin singing. Annalisa's dancing is in the future tense. Annalisa will dance. And that tells us properly that that event is happening after the singing of the song by Miguel. One more example. You will complete your studies next spring. By then, you will have attended over 90 hours of classes. Once again, there are two events described in this sentence. The first event is you're completing your studies. That's described in the future tense because it's something that's going to happen in the future, specifically next spring. You will complete your studies. That's the future tense. Now, what about the attending of over 90 hours of classes? Well, that's something that's going to happen prior to your completing of your studies. After all, attending all those classes, all of that is part of the process of the studies. So that's an event happening in the future prior to a future tense event. Therefore, it should be set up in the future perfect tense, and that's correctly done in this sentence. You will have attended over 90 hours of class. Will have attended is the future perfect tense, and that tells us that that event is going to happen prior to the completion of the studies. In all of these sample sentences, two events occur, and the proper verb tenses have been selected to make it clear which event comes first and which event comes later. Do you think you have a handle on how these 6 basic English verb tenses are used? Good. Turn to your study guide. You'll see we've created an exercise that will give you a chance to practice your understanding of how to use verb tenses to indicate the time when an action occurs. Try your hand at the exercise, and when you're finished, come back and we'll look at the questions together. Now, in this exercise, you're given several sentences, and in each one a verb is underlined. Your job is to figure out the time when the action described by the verb is taking place, and to use cues in the sentence to help you figure out whether the proper tense has been used. If the wrong tense has been used, your job is to figure out what tense would express the time of the action accurately. Let's look at the first example. I am a student at the Henderson Academy. I study there for the past 2 years. Now, in this sentence, the verb study has been underlined, and study is a present tense verb. It would be used to describe actions taking place right now. Now, is that the correct tense given what's happening in this sentence? Well, there are 2 actions described in this sentence. One is, I am a student at the Henderson Academy. Now, that's a present tense verb, meaning that being a student at the Henderson Academy is something that's happening right now. What about the studying? Is that something that's happening right now? Well, yes and no. Because I'm a student at the Henderson Academy, I am studying there now, but I've also studied there over the past 2 years. The sentence makes it clear that this is an event which took place in the past and is continuing up to today. Now remember, what English tense is used to describe that kind of action? The answer is the present perfect tense. The present perfect tense is used to describe activities that are happening in the past up to and including today. And since the studying is taking place in the past and up to today, we want to use the present perfect tense for that verb. And the present perfect tense, you'll recall, is formed by using the past participle and preceding it with the present tense of the verb to have. The correct form for this verb then would be have studied. That would be the present perfect tense, and the sentence would then read, I am a student at the Henderson Academy. I have studied there for the past 2 years. And now the proper sequence of events is perfectly clear. Let's take a look at the next example. By the time of our arrival in Houston next Sunday, we have traveled over 500 miles. Now in this sentence, again, 2 actions are being described. One is the arrival in Houston, and the other is the traveling over 500 miles. Now, when will these events take place, and what's the proper sequence? Which one will happen first? Which one will happen second? Well, we're told that the arrival in Houston is going to take place next Sunday, so that's a future event. Now, what about the traveling? Is the traveling going to take place before or after the arrival? Well, the traveling will take place before the arrival, because after all, we have to travel before we can arrive. So the traveling 500 miles is a future event that is taking place prior to some other future event. And therefore, we want to use the future perfect tense. And remember, the future perfect tense is formed by using will have as the helping verbs. So the proper form for this underlined verb would be will have traveled. And the sentence would then read, by the time of our arrival in Houston next Sunday, we will have traveled over 500 miles. And that lays out the sequence of the two events in this sentence quite clearly. Next example. Before he sprained his ankle, Charles exercises in the weight room 3 times a week. Once again, there are two events in this sentence. Charles sprained his ankle. That's a past tense event. That means it happened in the past. Now, before that, something else happened, namely Charles exercising in the weight room 3 times a week. What's the best tense to use to describe a past event happening prior to some other past event? The past perfect would be the best tense to use in that circumstance. So the right way to phrase the verb exercises would be had exercised. That's the past perfect form of the verb. And the sentence would then read, before he sprained his ankle, Charles had exercised in the weight room 3 times a week. Next, when she applied for her job at the airline, Diane stated that she had served in the U.S. Air Force. Now, we actually have 3 different events or activities in this sentence. She applied for her job at the airline. That's one event, and that's taking place in the past. Diane stated, so Diane stated or said something. That's another past event, and that took place at the same time as the application. And that makes sense. Part of the application for the job is explaining about her background. So she applied, she stated. Those are 2 past tense events, both described using the same verb tense and both describing events in the past happening more or less simultaneously at the same time. And then we have the third event, that she had served in the U.S. Air Force. Now, serving in the U.S. Air Force also happened in the past. Did it happen at the same time as the application and the statement? No, it happened before. She applied for the job at the airline, but before that, she had served in the U.S. Air Force. So the proper tense to use there would be the past perfect tense. Because remember, the past perfect tense is used to describe a past event happening before another past event. Now, is the past perfect tense used in this sentence? Yes, it is. Had served is the past perfect tense. So this particular sentence is perfectly correct. All the verbs used here are properly used, and they lay out quite clearly what the sequence of events is in this sentence. Next example. Last month, Luis has captured his 3rd consecutive championship in a college swim meet. Now, what's the timing of the event that's happening in this sentence? Well, we're told that it happened last month, so we can see that this is a past event being described. Now, what verb tense is being used here? What form of the verb is being used in the underlined verb? It says has captured. Now, has captured is the present perfect tense. Remember, the present perfect tense is uses the past participle, captured, together with the present tense of the verb to have. So here the present perfect tense is being used. Is that the correct tense to use in this sentence? Remember that the present perfect tense is used to describe past events extending up to today. Now, is the capturing of the championship by Luis, is that a past event continuing up to today? Not really. He captured the championship in the college swim meet last month. It happened then, and it was completed then. Therefore, this is simply a past action, not the kind of action that should be described in the present perfect tense. Instead of the present perfect tense, the simple past tense ought to be used. So the sentence should read, last month, Luis captured his 3rd consecutive championship in a college swim meet. Because the event took place in the past and was completed in the past, the simple past tense ought to be used, and that would be captured. So far in this program, we've talked about the 6 most important verb tenses in English. And we've seen that all 6 of those verb tenses are formed using the 4 principal parts of any verb. And remember, those 4 principal parts are the infinitive, the present participle, the past, and the past participle. Now, in this lesson, we're going to talk about one tricky element in English, which is the fact that not all verbs form their past and their past participle by simply adding ed to the basic form of the verb. It would be a simpler world if that were the case. But in English, there are a number of verbs that are called irregular verbs. Irregular verbs have past and past participle forms that are not made by adding ed. Well, how are the past and past participle forms of irregular verbs created? What's the rule? Unfortunately, there is no rule. There are many different irregular verbs, and they form their past and past participle forms in a variety of ways. In some cases, the past and past participle forms are one and the same. In other cases, they're different. And there's no one rule that explains how they're formed. Unfortunately, you simply have to study and learn the irregular verbs by memorization and practice. It's one of the things in English that makes learning the language a little bit tricky for people who didn't grow up speaking English. But I'll let you in on a little secret. Even people who grew up speaking English do sometimes find irregular verbs tricky to form and use. So you're not alone if you find this to be a challenge in using English correctly. Now, the most important irregular verb is the verb to be. It's important because it's used so often. The principal parts of the verb to be are be, being, was, and been. Be is the infinitive, being is the present participle, was is the past, and been is the past participle. Now, all the forms of the verb to be are a little bit complicated, confusing, and rather unexpected. So in your study guide, we've provided all the basic forms of the verb to be in the 6 most common English tenses. When you take a verb and provide all the basic forms of it, that's called conjugating the verb. So turn to your study guide and you'll see we've provided a complete conjugation of the verb to be. In some cases, you might feel that this is very simple and basic and you understand exactly how to use the verb to be. On the other hand, you may find this tricky and you may need to study and practice this. Based on your own background, devote some time to studying the conjugation of the verb to be if you need to in order to use the verb correctly. Now, we've also provided in the study guide a list of many of the most commonly used irregular verbs. And I'd like you to look at that list as well. The chances are good that some of the irregular verbs on this list are familiar to you, and you know well how to form the 4 principal parts. In other cases, however, you may find some of these irregular verbs unfamiliar to you, or you may feel that you're not really sure which part to use in what type of sentence. Therefore, studying the list that we've provided in the study guide should be helpful to you. Make sure in particular that you distinguish between the past and the past participle forms of the irregular verbs, because that's where many people trip up. The 2 most common mistakes that people make in using irregular verbs are the following. First, many people make a mistake by constructing the past or the past participle regularly. In other words, they treat the irregular verb as if it were a regular verb. Now remember, the past and the past participle forms of regular verbs are created by adding ed to the end of the infinitive or basic form of the verb. If you take an irregular verb and simply add ed in an attempt to turn that into the past or the past participle, you've treated the irregular verb as if it's regular, and what you've created is not proper English. Take a look at this sentence. Henri bringed his girlfriend to the movies. Now, in this sentence, the verb to bring is being used, and that's an irregular verb. However, the person who's created this sentence has made the mistake of creating the past form of the verb as if bring were a regular verb. He has simply added ed and turned bring into bringed. Unfortunately, that's not correct. Since bring is an irregular verb, we have to look at our study guide in order to determine how the past form of the verb would be created. And the past form of bring is brought. So the sentence ought to read, Henri brought his girlfriend to the movies. The incorrect form, bring, is the kind of thing that's commonly used as a mistake in English. Here's one more example. Maria has drived a taxi for the past 2 months. Now here the verb is has drived. This is the present perfect tense. And remember, the present perfect tense would be formed using the present tense of the verb to have together with the past participle, in this case of the verb to drive. Once again, drive is an irregular verb, and therefore we can't create the past participle simply by adding ed and turning it into drived. That would be correct if drive were a regular verb, but since drive is an irregular verb, that's not correct. Instead, we have to figure out how the past participle of drive is actually formed. And as you can see in your study guide, the past participle of drive is driven. And that would be the form of the verb that you would use with the helping verb to have. The sentence correctly should read, Maria has driven a taxi for the past 2 months. So once again, remember that irregular verbs form their past and past participle forms not simply by adding ed, but in different and somewhat unpredictable ways. You've got to memorize those special forms and use them correctly in sentences. The second type of error that people commonly make with irregular verbs is using the past where the past participle should be used, or vice versa. Remember that the past form of the verb is used by itself, whereas the past participle is always used with a helping verb, namely a form of the verb to have. You want to keep the past and the past participle separate in your mind and not use one where the other is called for. Take a look at this sentence. By tonight, I will have did all the research for my report. Now, in this sentence, the author is trying to use the future perfect tense, and that would be the correct tense to use to describe something that's going to happen in the future prior to some other specified time or event in the future. So the future perfect tense is fine. But remember, the future perfect tense needs to include the past participle of the verb. In this case, the verb to do is being used, and the wrong form of the verb has been inserted here. Instead of the past participle, the author of this sentence has used the past form of the verb to do, which is did. Instead, the past participle needs to be used, which is done. That would be the correct form of the verb to use with the helping verb, done rather than did. And then the sentence would correctly read, by tonight I will have done all the research for my report. The author of this sentence confused the past with the past participle and therefore created a wrong sentence. One more example. Juanita done her exercises before going to work. Once again, the verb to do is being used. Now, in this case, the past tense ought to be used because we're describing something that Juanita did in the past. Now, the past form of to do is did. The author of this sentence hasn't used the past. Instead, the author has mistakenly used the past participle done. So again, the sentence is incorrect because of a confusion between the past and the past participle. The sentence ought to read, Juanita did her exercises before going to work. Finally, one other special complication that is worthy of your noting and studying. There are two irregular verbs that are often confused and therefore cause many mistakes in English. These two irregular verbs are lie and lay. Let's take a look at the difference. Lie is an irregular verb that is intransitive. Remember, an intransitive verb is a verb that takes no direct object. In other words, the action of the verb to lie isn't passed along to something that receives the action. Instead, you just lie, period. There's no object which receives the action of the lying. The principal parts of the verb lie are lie, lying, lay, and lain. Lie is the present tense. Lying is the present participle. Lay is the past, and lain is the past participle. So lain is a form of the verb that would always be used with a helping verb. Therefore, for example, look at the following sentence. I will lie on the sofa. Here we're using the verb to lie because it is used intransitively. There is no direct object. I am not lying something, I am just lying. I will lie on the sofa. So the verb lie is being used correctly here. By contrast, lay is an irregular verb that is transitive. In other words, it always takes a direct object. When you lay, you have to lay something. You lay something, and therefore there is something in the sentence that will receive the action of the laying. It's a transitive verb. It has a different meaning, although it's clearly related to the verb lie, and therefore the verb to be used in this type of sentence would be a different verb, which is formed differently. Now, the principal parts of the verb to lay are lay, laying, laid, and laid. Notice that in the case of the verb to lay, the past and past participle happen to be the same. Laid and laid do not appear as principal parts of the verb to lie. Instead, lay and lain are the past and the past participle, respectively. So all these words which sound somewhat similar have very distinct meanings and distinct uses and need to be distinguished carefully. Take a look at this sentence. I will lay my books on the table. Is this the verb to lie or to lay? It's the verb to lay, and it's being used correctly here because it is being used transitively. That is, there is a direct object which is receiving the action of the laying. Something is getting laid, namely the books. The books are being laid on the table. Whereas the verb to lie does not take an object, the verb to lay does. And therefore, to lay is being used correctly in this sentence. So you need to always remember the difference between the verb to lie and the verb to lay, and then be sure that you use the correct principal part of each of these verbs whenever you're using one of them in a sentence. Useful information out of it, and I'll look forward to speaking with you about other English topics on other programs in this series.